Hi, and welcome back. David Bianco with you here. Today we're going to be comparing some versions of Alan Parsons' Eye in the Sky with the newly released MOFI 2LP 45 RPM being supposed benchmark. Let's see how it goes. We're also going to be looking at the type of equipment that I played it on because that's an important consideration too. That's all coming up next on the sound of Safe and Sound, Texas. Welcome back to the sound of Safe and Sound, Texas. Since we're from Texas, we're going to call this a shootout, which is what we call vinyl comparisons that are done, so it's only appropriate. But this shootout I'm going to do a little differently because it's really the first one I've done with any detail. I've done a previous one on Cyndi Lauper, but this one is going to be a little more in-depth, and I wanted to get some things on the record. No pun intended. So the equipment I use is something that I want to discuss with you because I think it's important for you to know what type of equipment I use. When people review things, a lot of times I don't, really know what they're using, and that makes a difference, of course. But it is all relative, of course. But I do believe it is something that is at least of interest and a way to understand the reviewer's system. And I'm going to give you some input on what I have. It's a relatively modest system. It is first, I have a stereo setup and I have a quadraphonic setup. Today I'm going to talk about my stereo 2-channel setup. I use an NAD, and that's a new acoustic dimension, and their 3140 model, which is from the 80s. It is an integrated amplifier, and it is rated at 40 watts per channel, which isn't very much on the surface, but these have what is called headroom, dynamic headroom, and so when they need the power to jump higher to maybe provide the bass that's needed or some kind of sound that really is loud, it's going to be able to go well past that 40 watts. It has 3 decibels of headroom. And so it performs more like about a 100-watt amp actually. But be that as it may, that amp back in the day was about a $300 amplifier. You can get a used one on the market for somewhere in that neighborhood even today. They're not made anymore, obviously. So it's not a really high-end amplifier in the sense of high dollar, but I think it is a pretty precise amplifier. And the phono preamplifier for the magnetic cartridge is built into that integrated amplifier. So I'm not using an external preamp. I have connected to that a dual 1245 turntable, which is an automatic turntable, and I'm running on that an Accutex 410E. Now, Accutex is a company that is no longer in business, but they made some very, very fine cartridges in the day, and it's one of my favorites. So it's a biradial type of a stylus, and I really enjoy what it does with a lot of my records. So that's the cartridge that's on it. Back in the day, that was a couple $100 cartridge maybe. Just to give you an idea. And the turntable itself was about a $400 turntable in the day. So these are more vintage, as you might be picking up on, things that were from the 80s. I think the Accutexes were out in the 90s as well. And so for the speakers that I use Polk Audios. Ever since I heard the first bookshelf Polk Audio 10s, I've been hooked on Polk Audios, and that's pretty much exclusively what I've used since the 80s. The ones that I'm using are called the RTA 11TLs. They're a floor standing model. You can get these used for, let's say $300. I think in the day they were probably around $600 a pair. So they're not outrageous, but their sound is amazing. And again, I've mentioned in the past that There are two real areas of transducers that are producing music in your system, really, and that is the cartridge when you're using vinyl, and then the speakers. And what that really means is your cartridge and your speakers can probably make the biggest difference in the sound, in the improvement in the sound. And again, those really should be tailored to your listening preferences, the room you're in, things of that nature. I've talked about that in a previous video that I will link up here. So the speakers that I use are the Polk Audios, and I also use headphones for a separate test that I'll talk about. I use the Sony MDR-V6s, which are a classic. They've been around for years and years, and they are my go-to headphones because I feel that they're probably the most neutral ones that I've heard. They're not expensive. They're about $70, $75, so they're not outrageous, and they're wired. They go directly into the integrated amp, the NAD, through the headphone jack, so no Bluetooth or any of that. So it's really direct. And so between the Polk speakers and the headphones, those are my two ways of listening. So my process is very simple. I have three sources in this case. We have the original album, we have the Speaker's Corner album, and we have the new MOFI release. So what I will do is I will listen to them in that order. I will listen to some key songs that I know well that are on the album, and I will listen to them on the speakers that I have. I will set a volume. I will leave that volume the same. All of the other settings are neutral. Bass and treble are neutral, so that there's no added emphasis. It's as recorded. And then I will listen to those tracks on the first album. I will then listen to the second album, same tracks, and then finally on the third album, the same tracks. Once I've had that listening experience, which I also will have a decibel meter out to compare the readings from the first, second, and third versions of the album to see which one's louder, just to get an objective measurement on that, to see which one has more punch and responsiveness because the bass is causing that meter to go higher. Just to have something there to look at and say this is what I've experienced, and I also see it in the graph. Once I've done that, I'll wait about an hour. I'll make my notes about what I've heard there, and then I will do the same process with the headphones on. And the reason I wait an hour is I want my memory to kind of flush a bit of what I've heard and kind of hit reset. And I also then want my ears to kind of recalibrate after having listened to it. Not that I listen to it super loud, but still you're listening to 80, 90 dB. And, I'd like to make sure my ears are relaxed and they're not affected by that. And then I'll listen on the headphones and make my notes and comparisons. And there are differences in what one picks up listening to headphones versus speakers, believe me. So what I'm going to be telling you is my overall impression then based on that process. So quickly, Eye in the Sky, Alan Parsons Project. It was their sixth studio album. It was recorded at Abbey Road Studios in London, which Alan was familiar with. He was, in fact, one of the co-engineers of Abbey Road, the Beatles' Abbey Road album, back in the late 60s. And so this album was recorded in 1981 and then completed in early 1982, released on Arista Records in 1982 May, and then it was nominated, in fact, for the Grammy for Best Engineered Album in 1983. And it was up against John Cougar's American Fool. It was up against the inveritable Dire Straits with Love Over Gold, and The Night Flight, Donald Fagen, a masterpiece. And then, of course, Alan Parsons Project. But none of those four won. The winner was Toto 4, which was a big blockbuster album, a smash album. But Best Engineered Album, wow. For me, I got to say, I think The Nightfly would win the day on that one from my personal experience and what I would say. But be that as it may, I'm not a voting member. This album also received an award in 2019 as a Grammy for the Best Immersive Audio Album at the Grammy Awards, the 61st Annual Grammy Awards, for its multi-channel mix. So the mystique and the quality of Alan Parsons' project lives on in this album, even here up to a few years ago. So let's get to the actual Shootout. So again, the first one I was listening to was the OG, or the original, which was pressed for Monarch pressing, and it was one that had the plates, I guess, were from Germany, because it actually had scripted in there, made in Germany. And so this is one that I think got around a bit, but it certainly was a surprising pressing. It was more quiet than I expected for just a standard old over-the-counter vinyl, $7.98 list price kind of thing. It had very respectable punch and emphasis on vocals and instruments. Very respectable. Respectable. It was satisfying, but didn't have quite that full sound stage that you kind of knew that was there, and the richness that you really were looking for. But again, even though it had kind of a little bit of a 2D kind of a sound, and what I mean by that is there wasn't a lot of depth, and where you could hear and kind of stage the sound in a manner to where you had things forward, things middle, things back. They were a little more together, but the clarity was really, really better than I had expected. So in its own way, it was very, very respectable. The other thing I noticed is that the pressing, the way it was cut, it had a really well-defined cut. And the other aspect is, in the dead wax was fairly small, so they cut about as far as they could, which means those grooves are stretched out a bit and not quite as close to each other, and that gives the cutter a little more room to be able to put those bass notes in there, and you certainly could tell that was the case. So really, I think well executed for an over-the-counter type album. Really, really surprising, actually. Next, I opened up my Speaker's Corner version, and literally I hadn't opened it yet, and I did it for the Shootout here. And as soon as I pulled the record out of the jacket, I had two visual observations very quickly. One is the cut seemed very light. It didn't seem very deep, and the dead wax was very wide, meaning that the cut hadn't gone as far as it could have, which meant to me the sound was probably not going to be as dynamic. Those are just things I, over time, have come to realize when I look. And sure enough, put on the record, and I was underwhelmed, which I'm really sad to say, because Speaker's Corner usually does a really good job. And so I had doubts about it before I even let the stylus hit the groove, and once it did, it was kind of pitiful. And so there's not a lot good I can say about it. I will say one thing about it. It was audibly softer and had less dynamic range, but it was very clean sound. I mean, it was very sterile kind of sound. But it reminds me of, and I don't want to start a controversy on this one, but there's a cartridge out there called a Nagaoka MP-110. And I have heard that cartridge lauded as, the greatest cartridge out there for $150 or whatever. I think it's about the price point. And every time I've listened to it, I would have to say I'm very uninspired. It's just, vanilla. It's just very, it doesn't do anything for me. And I've tried multiple systems, multiple records, and for me, it just quite doesn't do it. And when I listen to this album, it kind of reminded me, when I listened to the Speaker's Corner version, it kind of reminded me of the way I feel when I listen to some albums that I think really sound great, but then I listen to them with a Nagaoka. So that's just my perspective. Again, Speaker's Corner typically has been really top-notch. This one was really a disappointment. And so therefore, we're left with the mobile fidelity. And so what I would say about that is, immediately, it's a 45 RPM. it has a better chance, right? The quietness of the vinyl is not to be compared to. I mean, it was dead quiet vinyl. The sound stage was an experience of precision to me, and it was also very accurate. Where the placement of the voices and the instruments is so obvious and had much more of a 3D depth to it than that type of 2D flat presentation I was telling you about that I noticed a little more with the OG. Uh, and it was more obvious to me after listening to the MoFi that the OG lacked that. Uh, that's how these comparisons end up happening. The bass, some people have said the bass was too strong. And I would say for me, what I said is the bass was immersive without being overbearing. It was there, it got you, it got your attention, it was grabbing you where it needed to, it was emphasizing what was there, but it wasn't just blaring. It wasn't just there to be there. It was constructive and adding value. And the highs were really on target without being excessive. And there was no hint of any semblance at all like that, that S kind of sound where you get that. There was nothing there. The cut was very clean. It was well done, very, very well. The pluckiness of guitars was very evident, even like in the bass, you could really kind of feel the string, so to speak. The string section were smooth and they flowed with the texture of the instruments. It wasn't like the sound of them laid down on top as if added like in post production. They were really woven well, and the sound wove very well with this. And for me, there's just a richness and maturity, I guess I would call it, of the sound. Um, so I went back and I listened to this again after speakers on headphones and got very similar feeling. I'd say some of the soundstage things are a little different in headphones than they are with speakers because you don't really have quite the room depth and type of thing. And again, I would say that my impressions are very common and similar between the two. It's just that with headphones, you get a much more precise feeling in your head when you do get like instruments plucking and things of that nature. You feel it with a little more pressure, a little more instinct of what's going on with the sound because it's so close to you and you're immersed. So I would, if you don't have a good set of headphones or you don't listen on headphones, do it sometime because it really is a great experience. So what can I tell you? I will, the MoFi definitely sounds better, but I would say, it's what, $60? Is it worth the difference? Well, it's two albums. You got to get up more often to change it. It definitely has a good enough sound to where, yeah, if I want to listen to a few of these tunes, that's the one I'm going to pull out. But if I want to just play it all the way through and not have to mess with multi-sides, I'm perfectly fine with taking that OG version that I have and playing that as well because it really was well done. So, for casual listening, the OG is just great. If I really want to sit there and have an experience, then I'm definitely going to pull out the MoFi. And that's basically where I see it. It's pretty much exactly where I would have expected it to be, except for the fact that, hey, the Speaker's Corner did not really warrant $35. That's for sure. And the OG, $5, $10 record, whatever, uh, really did a great job. So I would tell you, if you're going to get an OG, look for that pressing that has the dead wax made in Germany. I think that's a good indicator. And again, look at that dead wax. How much is there? The less that's there, the better, because that means they made that cut stretch more, and as those grooves are more well defined. So again, it all boils down to the same outcome in the sense that, if you pay a little more, you get a little better. You've got to judge, is it worth the difference? That's not for me to judge, but it is for me to tell you I was a bit surprised at how good the OG came out and how poor in some ways the Speaker's Corner was in comparison. And again, that's a first for me. So again, I thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel. It's really helpful to me if you can subscribe, get your friends to subscribe, get notified when new videos are coming on. Also, of course, like the video. That always is very helpful. And comment. Give me your feedback on this. Any other albums you might want to see reviewed, let me know. So for now, it's David Bianco here saying goodbye from the sound of Safe and Sound, Texas. Take care, everybody.